Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 15 of The One New Man. We have taken a couple weeks off here with Thanksgiving, and we got some sick people, and it's been a rough go trying to get this back on its normal schedule. But we are back this week, and this is going to be one of the last sessions that we have that kind of close out really this modern historical look at the last 100 years of Israel. And so with that in mind, I'm actually going to tell a joke first. It's kind of a bad joke. It's kind of a dad joke. It's kind of, it's not my best work, but it's also not, it's not the worst thing ever either. So, okay. So here's the joke. So Abraham was interacting with God, and God's like, Abraham, I have this incredible thing I want to give you. I have this land that is flowing with milk and honey. And Abraham's like, wow, milk and honey? You say it's flowing with milk and honey? That sounds amazing. And God's like, yeah, no, it's incredible. It's got mountains. It's next to the ocean. You can produce amazing food from it. It's got some desert, but the desert's really pretty too. And Abraham's like shaking his head. He's like, God, this sounds really amazing. Like, I love this. And then he pauses. He's like, well, what's the catch? And God's like, well, wait until you hear about the neighbors. And so that's kind of the idea of what we're going to be talking about today, is that you've got this land surrounded by people that hate you. Anyway, so with that in mind, we're going to talk about I'm specifically going to be talking about Hamas and Hezbollah today, giving a little bit of the context and the origin story of how they have kind of arrived to be where they are, and actually are kind of seemingly on their way out in some ways, or at least greatly diminished after the last couple of weeks of stuff that's been happening over there. And then John is going to give a little bit more of the backstory with Iran. So, John, do you want to add anything before I?
No, I was just going to say, you were talking about them being on the way out. I think that, one of the major things is they probably won't be using pagers any longer.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Among other things.
That's right. So first we're going to talk about Hamas, and Hamas is really interesting. So, I think in general, for people that are not familiar, like the Palestinian people, like many people, they're not like monolithic, and that they're not everyone is a Muslim. They have Palestinian Christians. They've got Palestinian atheists. I've even heard of Palestinian Marxists. I mean, so, to view any kind of group of people as like one shade of color, I think is generally not a great way to approach the complexity of humanity generally. And the same thing with Palestinians. Traditionally, there have been two main areas of the Palestinian territories, and that's the West Bank and that's Gaza. And for people that are not familiar, in between West Bank and Gaza is Israel. And so you have essentially almost two disconnected areas or territories that are technically Palestinian. And within each one of these two territories, you have different ruling factions. Okay. And so Hamas resides primarily in Gaza, although they've tried to influence the West Bank. And Gaza shares a southern border, the Rafah border, with Egypt. And so this has traditionally caused Israel a lot of problems because they're not really able to manage what happens on the southern border. And so this is where a lot of the weapons and the stuff that they use for terrorism has come up through the southern border. And so just to give some kind of geography context, we're going to be talking specifically about Hamas, who has ruled Gaza since 2007 and even massively influential before that. But so the name of Hamas, the meaning of the name is zeal, and it's actually an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. What's really interesting about Hamas is that early on, Israel actually supported Hamas because Hamas was supposedly going to be the less militant faction of the that came out of really when the PLO was established, which is the Palestinian Liberation organization in 1967. And they were extremely violent when they first came on the scene, and they were very very aggressive in their tactics. This eventually changed, and now they're actually, the PLO is considered the official governing body of all the Palestinian Authority. So when they go to negotiate at the UN, or when they go to the Oslo Peace Accords, all these things, it's always the PLO that's negotiating. And that really changed with Yasser Arafat in the 90s, who was also very militant early on. And then he kind of, he basically renounced terrorism and accepted the state of Israel. And then that kind of changed during the Intifada. And so that's really ebbed and flowed, how the Palestinian Liberation organization has interacted. But what I found so interesting is that actually Israel was behind Hamas early on, because they believed that Hamas was going to be the less militant version of all of the different factions that were rising up in the Palestinians. So, early on, Hamas flowed out of the Islamic Brotherhood. Now, the Islamic Brotherhood was primarily Egyptian in its origin, and it really was kind of the same mentality that was in the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, is what really birthed Hamas. And so, they legally registered in Israel in 1978 as a charity, actually, which is so crazy. So, they would do things like, they would take care of people at the mosque. They would run food banks. They would do all this kind of social welfare work early on. And so when Israel saw this, they were like, okay, well, we're going to get behind this group because they seem to be, much more reasonable and less militant than what's happening with the PLO and Fatah and all these things that were kind of happening in the West Bank. And so, their whole thing, Hamas's whole thing early on in its founding, was to kind of help Palestinian refugees and to help to just kind of be a social welfare organization. And so, through that obviously changed. A lot of that changed right after the Iranian Revolution, which happened in 1979. And John, I'm sure we'll talk about that to some degree. But that was a real turning point for both Hezbollah and Hamas, and really changed a lot of it really emboldened a lot of the more militant factions in the Middle East. And so, at that point, Hamas comes out with a charter, which is very, very genocidal towards Israel. I'm going to read just a couple things. This is from their first official charter that they put out. But it says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And so it also goes on to say the Islamic resistance movement is a distinguished Palestinian movement whose allegiance is to Allah and whose way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, for under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety where their lives, possessions, and rights are concerned, which has proven not even true for the Palestinians. So that's obviously not something that would have ever been true for Israelis or for Jews. They were also extremely against all of the peace talks that happened in Madrid and Oslo throughout the years. They would specifically try to, do terrorist attacks when these agreements were going on, to just show that they were not part of this idea for peace. And so, in their official charter, it says the call is to jihad. The days the enemies are upon us in Muslim lands. So jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim. In the face of the Jews' usurpation, it is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. So it's just more and more of this kind of, we're against Zionism, we're against Jews, we accept, the militant response to this. It's just on and on and on about this. And this is their own words. So this is not anyone trying to paint them in any kind of light. This is what they've said. So really this shift from being this kind of humanitarian organization with Hamas, which Israel supported, happened in 1988. And, this is when they released this Islamic covenant and charter, which I just read to you guys. And so they basically, you could summarize their position as that there is no solution for the Palestinian struggle except through jihad, which is holy war. It states that any Muslim who leaves the struggle against Zionism is guilty of high treason. Its platform calls for the creating of an Islamic republic over every inch of Palestine to replace Israel. And it goes on to say that Muslims should raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. And so, they're very open and upfront about their concept that jihad is the only way forward. And so, sometimes you'll hear, I'll hear on social media that's like, well, Israel really founded Hamas. They funded Hamas. They intentionally tried to conquer and divide. And I think there's probably elements of, of course, Israel's looking at both of these two factions and trying to figure out which one is going to be less violent to us. So there is some truth to the idea that Israel helped in many ways stand up Hamas. But what people don't recognize when they say that is that Hamas's early goals were not the destruction of Israel. They had really spent 12 to 15 years operating as a humanitarian organization, and that all changed in 1988. So, there's two wings of Hamas. There's the military arm, which has something like 40,000 soldiers. The final form of this, it's taken on many iterations and forms over the last 30 years, but the final form is called the Qassam Brigade, which was founded in 1992. The second arm is called the Mahmad, which focuses on internal policing of Arabs. And so they're very, very worried about any Arab who's collaborating with Israel. So you can kind of see the two wings of Hamas. One is outwardly trying to create unrest, to do terrorism, to do all the different things that kind of we see on the news. But then they also have an internal arm that's all like secret police and, kind of stuff that they're really trying to make sure that there's no one who's interacting with Israel, that there's no one collaborating with Israel. And really you could see that as more of kind of the secret service, if you will, or of Hamas. And that's how they view it. So in 2007, Hamas seized control of Gaza. They won this election in a landslide. And they immediately started throwing their enemies off roofs. These are Arabs that they were doing this. They were kneecapping people. I mean, it was a really tumultuous time in 2006, 2007 when Hamas took power. And they had been doing, terrorism and what they call freedom fighting for 15 years. And so on one hand, it's like kind of hard to look at this and say, why did the people like vote for this? But I think these things don't happen in a vacuum. I think that there are probably things that Hamas did early on, even when they were kind of shedding the more social welfare work that they were doing. I think that they originally kind of painted themselves as almost a Robin Hood kind of group that, we're going to be helping you and it's necessary to be fighting Israel and we're doing this on your behalf. And, when I'm listening to some of the conversations and kind of reading some of the stuff they were reading, you get the sense, especially if all you're getting is one side of the story or propaganda or whatever it is, you kind of see how people who felt, and I'm not saying I agree with any of this. I'm just trying to kind of I'm just trying to see, understand why people would vote someone like Hamas into power. And I think that there were a lot of promises that Hamas made that none of them came true. I mean, they've completely mismanaged all the money. It's very obvious, I think, to most Palestinians today that Hamas has not done any of the things that they said that they would do, that their life has gotten, considerably worse. And so there were a lot of promises made during this time, and I think none of them were established, which I think most people could have seen early on, especially if they were standing outside of the situation. And so, Hamas is known for guerrilla warfare. They will infiltrate into Israeli communities, like we saw on October 7th. They're very known for kidnapping soldiers, for kidnapping Israelis. They'll booby trap boats and try to roll these boats into docks into Israel. They will do all sorts of tunneling underneath Israel and into Rafah, which started in 2015. They're also very known for their suicide bombing and just any kind of guerrilla warfare. So there have been major...
Chris, can I interrupt you for just a second? Because
totally.
A few thoughts on my mind from some things you said.
Yeah.
I don't have this in my notes at this point, but when was it that Israel pulled out of, the Jewish communities out of Gaza? Was it 2005 or was
2005.
it? Okay.
Yeah.
The only reason I mention that is I think it's very important in this context that, one of the accusations that has been against Israel in this current war. People came up to me when I've shared with groups, and they say, "Yeah, well, Israel just wants to go back, and they want to take over.
Mm-hmm.
They've always wanted to take over Gaza," which is totally not true.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, because we were living in Israel at that point when Israel decided to remove the Jewish communities. Now, these were communities in Gaza. They had not taken over Palestinian land. They had bought land. In fact, most of it was, these were sand dunes. Mm-hmm. And I think whoever sold this to the Israelis went away laughing, and it was fascinating. Most of the Israelis that lived there at that point were religious because it was dangerous. Their school buses were attacked and so on and so forth. And they produced amazing agriculture, I don't know if I had ever talked about this before on our podcast, but when we went into those communities, we actually brought prayer groups into those communities, and they showed what they had done. Nobody thought they could grow anything in sand, but what they did is they went to countries with coconuts, and those countries would use the fruit of the coconuts, throw away the shells. Israel bought the shells, ground them up, put it in the sand, and then they grew vegetables there.
Wow.
And so anyway, when Israel, I think Ariel Sharon was then the prime minister, when they decided to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza, again, all this pressure on Israel, land for peace. Just give up land and you'll have peace, which is exactly what didn't happen. Not in the security zone of southern Lebanon and not in Gaza. These religious Jews who were living there were heartbroken, and the army had to go in and actually evacuate them. And there were scenes on Israeli television where the Jews who were living there went up on the rooftops of their synagogues. Remember, most buildings in Israel are flat, so they're up on the rooftops, and soldiers were going up on ladders and carrying them down over their shoulders, sometimes with tears, because these people's hearts were absolutely broken. So anyway, that's one thing. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, Chris, just as a clarification, I think you said that there were supposedly 40,000 fighters in Hamas. I think that number has been diminished significantly in this current war, by the way.
Totally. Yeah. This was before this most recent, this was it was even before the October 7th of last year data. Right. But that's a great point, John. And I think it's something that is hard for people to understand, that Israel sent Israeli soldiers in to remove Jews from Gaza by force. Because of all of the peace treaties, and because when they pulled out of Gaza, they took everything. And this was not land that was given by the UN. This was not land. This was land that the Israelis purchased from Palestinians that had been completely unproductive. It was literally just like you're saying, it was just sand, and so Israel had purchased this land legally. They went in, they established their homes, they established their communities. And so those photos and those scenes are pretty wild if people can find them from that time. And so that is definitely something that you do not hear the other side talk about. So now we're going to look a little bit at who has supported Hamas, because this is an important part of this. I'm not going to touch on this a ton, John, because I'm sure you will, but one of the main supporters of Hamas has been Iran. And so Iran started supporting Hamas in 1992. This was a combined effort of both sides to try to derail the peace process that was happening in Madrid and Oslo. They started at that point giving Hamas $30 million a year for their fighters. And then that same year, Hezbollah had taught Hamas how to make suicide bombs. So this is really interesting. At one point, the IDF and Shabin had kicked many of these Hamas terrorists out of Israel. They deported them up to Lebanon. And so what happens in Lebanon is that Hezbollah teaches them how to make suicide bombs. This is really how this happened. And then all this international pressure comes back onto Israel to reallow these men who they've deported to come back into Gaza. And so eventually Israel allows this to happen. So these guys come back into Gaza who have just spent like 2 years learning how to make suicide bombs from Hezbollah. And that's when this really starts to pick up, and you start seeing the suicide bombing start to become a major, major problem for Israel. So that's actually how that transpired. And so this was during the Second Intifada. Iran used Hezbollah to smuggle weapons to Hamas, and Iran gave Hamas much more sophisticated weapons and rockets and the whole 9 yards. A lot of their real backing came from Iran, which you'll talk about. And so Iran was also very significant in trying to get Hamas to not repartner or open up conversations with Fatah. So Fatah eventually becomes more of the peaceful, at least the more peace-oriented Palestinian group that's in the West Bank. And so Iran was always trying to stir strife between these two groups to make sure that they would not neutralize kind of their conversation together, because I think that they were worried that Fatah would maybe influence Hamas to, move away from more of the violence that they were very known for. So Qatar also has been a big supporter of Hamas. Qatar is just a very wealthy Gulf state. Many of the senior Hamas officials over the last 10 years have had homes and luxury lifestyles in Qatar. And so they'd be making millions of dollars running operations from Qatar while, Palestinians suffer and while they just send people into essentially slaughter against Israel. And so Qatar has provided a lot of shelter, a lot of cover, finances, and really lavish lifestyles for a lot of Hamas leadership. it's interesting because in the West Bank, Palestinians in West Bank don't identify with Gaza. So conflict can happen in Gaza, and it doesn't really affect the people in West Bank so much. Like sometimes you'll see maybe small factions that will be upset about it, but generally speaking, West Bank has not been overly concerned about when Gaza would go do something. Like they don't identify with that same struggle in the way that Gaza does. But Palestinians in Gaza really identify with Palestinians in the West Bank. And so, there's been ongoing activity by Hamas to try to weaken Mahmoud Abbas and anyone who is just at all trying to neutralize ties with Israel. And so there is, in many ways, even West Bank and Gaza are to some level conflicted because, West Bank has been trying to, really establish himself as more of a neutral party. And this doesn't always, the Second Intifada, this did not happen. There has been obviously some terrorism out of West Bank, but it's nothing compared to what's happened in Gaza over the last 25 years. And that's primarily because Hamas has been in Gaza. And oftentimes, actually, the IDF will work with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank to try to destabilize anything that's happening with Hamas. So Hamas will try to set up sleeper cells and things like this in the West Bank, and the IDF and the Palestinian Authority will partner because they're both trying to get Hamas influence out of the West Bank. And so that's just another kind of interesting data point in this whole thing. And then we're going to just look at Hamas and Turkey. And so, Turkey has been a major player with Hamas as well. They have granted Hamas members citizenship in Turkey, which then allows these terrorists to essentially go all over the world because now they have this Turkish passport, so they can go to these other places where they never would have been able to do that with a Palestinian passport. And so Turkey will actually give citizenship to many members of Hamas. Hamas has made and planned many terrorist attacks from Turkey. And then in 2024, Turkey cut off relationship with Israel after October 7th and the incursion into Gaza. And so, what's interesting is that after October 7th, the international pressure on Qatar got so bad that they had to essentially kick all these leaders from Hamas out of Qatar. So they were no longer allowed to live there. Now, when that happened, Turkey took all these leaders in. And so really, in many ways, Turkey has kind of become offering the same quarter that Qatar at one point offered. And so, within this, we're seeing really Turkey totally turn their back on any kind of this peace process in this area. But what's really interesting is that in 2019, Saudi Arabia turns on Hamas. And so they arrest something like 68 Hamas operatives inside of Saudi Arabia, and then they publicly try them for terrorism. And so this happened in 2019. So this has been like a real turning point. And maybe at some point when we have Kalev on, John, we can talk to him a little bit about Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has become a really big advocate for the peace process in the Middle East. And so that started really kind of happening in 2019. And this was a dramatic shift from Saudi Arabia's earlier support for Hamas. So I think, kind of the final analysis of Hamas, the way that I see it, is that they've really ruined the lives of the Palestinians. I mean, they've forced, by just their aggravation on Israel, they've forced Israel to go in and just really take out major parts of Gaza, and it ends up just being totally bad for Palestinians and for people that don't want to be in the conflict, which is many of the Palestinians. In 1979, the Hamas founder was supported by Israel, like people will read occasionally online. But Israel's hopes was that they would stand against Yasser Arafat, who at the time was really, really militant. And so their hope was that Hamas would be more of a social welfare organization, but that did not end up happening. And they kind of split off and became the terrorist organization that we know now. In 1992, when the IDF deported many of these terrorists, they went up to Lebanon. This is where they were deported to. They learned all the suicide bombing and stuff that they brought back to Israel, like we talked about. And then Hamas has just kind of continually attempted to erect peace deals between the PLO and Israel in the 90s. In 2006, when Hamas swept these elections, they did this under the promise that they would change and that they would do all this good. None of this good has been done. And so I think, as we've seen over the last 18 months, Hamas has really, really been cut down in terms of their capabilities. And maybe this will bring an opportunity for new leadership to rise up in Gaza that would actually have the general Palestinian population's best interests at heart and not just destroying Israel. And so I think that could be maybe a hope for right now, So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, John. I'm going to just
I know you're going to move on to Hezbollah, but yeah, the only thing I would say, I mean, this is a great generalization. You've touched on this, Chris, is just, there are a lot of people, especially today, and especially since the war that followed the attack on Israel on October 7th, that, humanitarian concerns for the people in Gaza, and they're certainly justified to care about the people there. Mm-hmm. But it needs to be understood that for Hamas to cease being the ruling power in Gaza is by far the best thing for the Palestinians that are living there. Billions of dollars have been poured into the Gaza Strip, which Hamas, rather than using to build infrastructure to better people's lives, industry, to raise, the welfare of the people, et cetera, they've used those funds to build the greatest underground terror structure in the history of the world. And then they attack Israel, and then Israel responds, by fighting them, and they're hiding in tunnels while the population above ground is suffering from this war. And so I think that those people out there that are concerned about the welfare of the Palestinians in Gaza should root for Hamas to be utterly defeated, driven out of Gaza, and that then the population there can have much better lives.
Yep, I totally agree. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about Hezbollah, who's in the north. One of the things about Hezbollah's location is that they're able to get much more sophisticated weapons than Gaza is, because they're living primarily in Lebanon, but they also have headquarters in Damascus and Syria, and all these places are easily accessible by other Arab nations. And so, one of the things that you'll frequently see is more sophisticated rockets and weapons being used from the north of Israel by Hezbollah, because there's so much easier access to get them these weapons. And so their name means that the Party of God. They're a radical Shia Muslim group out of Lebanon. John's going to probably talk a little bit about Shia and Sunni, the differences between that. I'm sure with Iran, John, you'll at least touch on that, right?
I'm not going to talk about the divide, but I am going to talk about Shiism and some of their beliefs. Okay. I'm not going to talk about that difference, but it is significant.
So the main goal then is to establish the Islamic government across the Arab world that will liberate Jerusalem and the entire area of the present-day state of Israel. So again, its main focus is rooting out any Jewish or Israeli influence in this area and raising the Islamic flag over Jerusalem. It was also birthed out of the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard is the one that has trained many of the soldiers in Lebanon. And so this is going to be, fighters from Iran that are coming over to Lebanon to train Hezbollah. Hezbollah really, really, really hates the U.S. and by extension, Israel. They see the U.S. and Israel as being interconnected. Like a lot of these terrorist organizations, they also do social welfare work. This seems to be a primary thing that you see over and over. Theme is that a lot of these terrorists will try to do social work, and I think it's probably just to somehow alleviate all the stuff that they're causing, to show that they're useful actually for the people that are living there. Hezbollah, as with Hamas, has worked heavily with the UN. In fact, the UN peacekeepers were part of a kidnapping of Israeli soldiers in 2004, which was an international thing. I think they kidnapped 3 or 4 soldiers, and it ended up being that the UN peacekeepers were part of the Hezbollah group that ended up kidnapping these soldiers, which is so crazy. So you frequently see this, that somehow over and over the UN gets tangled up with being part of the terrorism of Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah says that they're for the Lebanese people, but ultimately they really serve Iran, which John will talk about and his piece of this. One of the interesting things that I saw was that Lebanon has very strong laws against normalizing ties with Israel. So you could be like a gamer playing like Call of Duty or something online, and if you see that someone's playing from Israel and you're in Lebanon, you are not allowed to like even talk to them during the game. If you see this on Twitter, or if you see this on Reddit, or you see someone communicating from Tel Aviv, for instance, you are not allowed to legally interact with that person online. And so you see stuff like this has really done a lot of damage on just kind of rehumanizing people towards each other, and even just these like low stakes environments of interacting on the internet, for instance, because of these laws that Lebanon has that they are now not allowed to interact with Israel in any way. So Hezbollah's key political aims are they've tried to brand themselves a peaceful movement, which they're totally not. They have come out and said multiple times that they believe that the best strategy is things like the first and second intifada. That's the best way forward to remove Israel. They've been accused of destabilizing the people in Lebanon who want peace, and their main primary motivation is driving Jews out of Muslim lands. They've also, what's interesting about Lebanon is it's very much a religious and ideological heterogeneous society. So there's a lot of variance. I mean, there's Christian Lebanese, there's Muslim Lebanese, there's Druze, there's agnostic and just more secular Lebanese. And so before Hezbollah came to power, Lebanon was like a very flourishing, almost secular in many ways culture. You look at photos from like the 70s and the beaches, and I mean, it looked almost like what you would see in San Diego. I mean, it really looked like a flourishing nation, and Hezbollah has just totally destroyed all of that.
I think, Chris, if I may, sorry for interrupting, I think it was actually a very popular tourist designation or destination, I should say, and I think it was called the Paris of the Middle East.
Yeah, it was. That's exactly what it was, and so. Which just really shows that, how destructive having even these terrorist groups that are smaller in nature, can just destabilize an entire nation. And so it's really, really disappointing to see what's happened there. And so, Hezbollah cooperates with other militant Islamic organizations, Hamas, Iran, Turkey. They've even partnered with Al-Qaeda in some ways. And so they were the ones that really trained Hamas in the ways, the suicide bombings. They're also the ones that have all the long-range missiles. Israel just this week blew up tons of chemical weapons, which are totally illegal to use even by, modern standards of warfare. And so they have been at least the most well-armed enemy that was directly on one of Israel's borders, and they've recently just been almost completely wiped out by Israel, thank God. And so that's really, John, that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to let you kind of give the backstory on Iran, because they're really the one who kind of the puppet master, if you will.
Yeah, no problem. And it's interesting, Chris, maybe I'll mention this again, maybe not, but when you talked about, how well armed Hezbollah is, because of course, there was basically a thoroughfare from Iran who was arming them through Syria. But that has been immensely compromised and destroyed actually within the last, week. So that's changing this whole dynamic. And we'll mention this again. Okay. So what we do know is that Israel's currently in a 7-front war. And I say currently because this has been sort of the headline news ever since October 7th and the war that followed, and is still following. But this has been going on for a very long time. And these 7 fronts, Chris has talked about. 2 of them are Hamas and also Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also in the West Bank itself. Actually, it's Judea and Samaria really is the biblical name for it. You have Gaza, you have Hamas functioning there, and also other Islamic groups as well. You have the Islamic jihadi groups in Syria, Islamic resistance in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. But as has been referred to many times, the head of this snake, this 7-headed snake, but the primary head of the snake is Iran itself. And so the things that I'm going to comment on today relate to Iran. And there's much reference to Iran, by the way, referred to Persia, that that time in the Bible. The first Persian Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. It has borne the name, or had borne the name Persia for 2.5 millennia until it was renamed by King Reza Pahlavi in 1935. So the Hebrew Bible contains 240 references to ancient Persia. Some of the most significant refer to King Cyrus. He had a major impact, actually, on what took place in Israel. Judah had been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar's troops from Babylon, and Judeans were exiled to Babylon between 597 and 596 BC. Babylon then afterward was conquered by Persia, so these Jewish prisoners came under Persian control at that point. The prophet Jeremiah had prophesied about this captivity, that it would last for 70 years, and it was actually Cyrus, the Persian king, who God used to fulfill that word of bringing these Jewish exiles back to Judah and back to Jerusalem. And it's very, very interesting. I find this fascinating that Isaiah prophesied that this pagan king, as far as we know, he didn't have a relationship with the living God, but that God was going to use him. The God of Israel was going to use him mightily. This is Isaiah 44 and verse 28. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, that's God's shepherd, and he shall perform all my, God's pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid. So Cyrus, again, when these Judean exiles had come under his control, he issued a decree that permitted the Jewish people to return back to Jerusalem. And not only did he permit them to go back, but he actually commissioned them to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. And it's sort of funny because he's actually referred to by some as the world's first Zionist, this Persian, again,
Interesting.
king. Okay, so just a couple more verses that relate to what he did. It's pretty amazing. This is Ezra 1 and verses 1 through 3. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of the king of Persia. I love this because God can work through anyone, whether they know it or not.
Totally.
It's God. So that he made a proclamation through all his kingdom and also put it in writing saying, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth, the Lord God of heaven has given me. So there's obviously something's happened here in this king's heart that he's recognizing that God is sovereign over all these things. And he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem, which is a pretty amazing proclamation, again, for this Persian king. It's interesting, Chris, and I'm not going to get off into this, but, some people that feel like God has really used Donald Trump in the past and is going to use him again for God's purposes, have actually referred to Donald Trump, in relationship to a Cyrus. In other words, because he's been, criticized for his lifestyle and maybe he's not really a very adamant believer, et cetera. Although I think, what happened in Pennsylvania with his ear, might have caused him to be a stronger believer at this point. Nevertheless, though, it's just sort of interesting that parallel has been drawn. Also, Persia, not directly, but Persia is also mentioned in the New Testament. I don't know if many people recognize this, but in Acts 2, there's a record of the people who had come up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish feast of Shavuot, Pentecost, and the first three people groups mentioned in Acts 2 were from Persia, the Parthians, the Medes, and the Elamites. And it's actually, hundreds of years later, church history records the existence of hundreds of churches in Persia, and that it was the Persians who took the gospel to China through the Silk Road. And what's also interesting is at that time, the Chinese actually referred to Christianity as the Persian religion. So So what changed, that transformed this positive and blessed relationship between ancient Persia and Israel into Iran's current obsession with an objective, which is to annihilate the modern nation of Israel? Well, we can trace it back to a transition that took place. This was the Arab defeat of the Persians in the 7th century and the imposition of Islam as the main religion of the Persian Empire at that time and also going forward. So Muhammad, Islam's founder, he was not only successful as a teacher and a politician, but also as a military leader. And his followers followed in his footsteps. These Muslim armies invaded and conquered areas that are now Jordan, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Persia. Their expansion also continued into areas that are now India, Russia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Serbia, and Austria. Well, a lot of people don't understand. I mean, Islam stretched from Europe to Asia to Africa. In essence, Islam ruled the world for approximately 1,000 years. They were the dominant power in the world for 1,000 years. And so the key to understanding the conflict in the Middle East today is really focused on this, that Islam's military and political success and domination were a confirmation to Muslims that their religious beliefs were true, that Israel is the final religion, and that Islam was going to make the rest of the world submit, which is what the name Islam means, is submission. And this is, by the way, Chris, a very big difference that I see really that was on the calling of Israel. I don't say that Israel fulfilled this very well, but Israel was called to be a light to the nations. In other words, to live in such a way, even the law, when God gave the law, he didn't give it to all of mankind. He gave it to this nation. And then by Israel living by God's laws, they were to be an influence by that light to the rest of the world. But Islam is different than that. In Islam, there is a belief that there is a responsibility upon Muslims to impose Sharia law, and if necessary, to do it violently. And this is, in essence, what happened through these thousands of years. But this all began to change in the 1600s with the defeat of the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman armies were driven out of Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Albania, and Russia. Muslim rule was also overthrown in Asia and Africa. And worst of all, Chris, in Muslim eyes, is that European armies invaded and overcame Arab lands, which were considered to be the center of the Islamic universe. And then the final, and again, in the view of Islam, the final debacle took place at the beginning of the 20th century when the Ottomans allied with Germany and shared in Germany's defeat. And so, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and based on the League of Nations mandate, which we've talked about before, the French took over governance of Lebanon and Syria, and Britain took over Jordan, Iraq, and what was then called Palestine. By the first decades of the 20th century, more than 90% of Muslims lived under European and, to them, Christian infidel rule. Only 5 areas remained independent: Turkey, Afghanistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So to quote a very well-known terrorist leader, Osama bin Laden, and this is a quote from Osama bin Laden: "Following World War I, the whole Islamic world fell under," quote, the Crusader banner. So Islam had experienced 1,000 years of incredible success and 300 years of crushing failure. So many of the leaders in Islam ask the question, why? I mean, what happened that we were so successful for 1,000 years and now we've been crushed for 300? And the prominent belief, an answer by the Muslim radicals, is the assertion that Muslims had forsaken true Islam.
Mhm.
And this is, of course, that belief is one of the things that has influenced greatly what has taken place
What's
in
that? What's
modern
that?
day Iran.
That true Islam has never been tried.
Yes. Well, I think they're trying to try
Right,
it.
right.
Yeah, so,
The problem with Islam is that true Islam has never been tried.
okay. So
Hmm.
again, we're going to now talk about modern Iran. In 1925, the Pahlavi dynasty took over hold of Persia and established actually a secular society there and wanted to westernize. In fact, in 1935, they exchanged the name Persia for Iran, which is very, very interesting because Iran means the land of the Aryans. And I still haven't figured this out, Chris, because, we know that Hitler, basically, had a great emphasis on this Aryan race, which was supposedly the superior race. And I think he thought that it was basically Germanic and Nordic. But the Aryans actually came from the area of Iran. So I don't know where Hitler and where the Nazis got that, but very, very interesting. Okay, so they changed the name, and that change, this is the Pahlavi dynasty, actually boded well for the Jews that were in Iran at that time. During World War II, the Iranian government actually protected the Jews by keeping them from Nazi deportation. And so the relationship between the Jews and Iran were mostly favorable until 1979, even though Iran did not vote in favor of the modern nation of Israel in 1948 at the United Nations. But Israel helped to develop Iran's armed forces between 1958 and 1967, while Iran supplied Israel with crude oil. All of that dramatically changed. The Israeli-Iranian relationship dramatically changed in 1979 when the pro-Western Shah of Iran was overthrown by this Islamic theocracy. Back in 1964, Ayatollah Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini,
the names are tough.
I did the best I did. I could anyway. It wasn't great, but anyway, okay. He had been exiled again from Iran in 1964. On February 1st of 1979, he returned to Iran and 10 days later proclaimed the Islamic Republic of Iran under his leadership. And I'll just mention here that, my understanding, I'm certainly no expert on Iran, is the vast majority of just the normal citizens of Iran are really not very happy or supportive of this Islamic power that is ruling over them. And you hear lots of stories of underground churches there and God, moving mightily in that way, et cetera. Okay.
There is an amazing, it's called Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, I think, documentary about the underground church in Iran, which is amazing. If people can, I think it's free on YouTube. But to just reiterate what you're saying there, John.
Well, absolutely. It's something we need to be praying for and supporting for
absolutely.
Sure. Okay. But Khomeini's goal was essentially to bring about a revolution to replace this non-Islamic political order with a new political order based on Sharia law. Immediately his new regime withdrew recognition of Israel as a state, severed all diplomatic and commercial ties with Israel, and began referring to the Israeli government as a Zionist regime and Israel as occupied Palestine. This is interesting. The first dignitary invited to visit Iran, I didn't know this before, after the revolution was not a leader of a sovereign state, but it was Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And on that same day, he was handed the keys to the building that had previously housed the Israeli delegation in Tehran. That Israel must be destroyed has been Iran's official government policy since 1979. And to carry out this death sentence, Iran established this series of proxies, you talked about two of them, Hamas and Hezbollah, that surround Israel and who were referred to as, and maybe still are, as the Ring of Fire. I mentioned them in my first comments. What is very interesting, and again, I'm not prepared to talk about this today, it's taken place in the last week and a little bit more. Well, some of it's taken place, obviously, over the last year. But this ring of fire, has their influence and their power has been greatly diminished. Number one, through what's taken place in Gaza with Hamas, who's been basically devastated in Gaza. Hezbollah, which Israel has profoundly weakened, in Lebanon, and now what's taken place again. Although Iran is blaming the United States and Israel for this, what has taken place in Syria. Basically, you had these Syrian militants who have been fighting the Assad regime, but they saw a tremendous opportunity again with Hezbollah being weakened, and then Iran being weakened, by recent attacks by Israel and so on, that they could finally overthrow this Assad regime. So when these rebels in Syria saw these forces weakened, they took over the country, and Israel sort of they're standing back. They're willing to have a decent relationship with these rebels. They previously had been associated with ISIS, and the leader was definitely a radical Islamist. He's speaking differently now, but we know Israel has actually gone in and taken over certain areas of the Golan Heights, just again to wait till things settle in Syria. Okay, back to Iran. So before we conclude with a biblical view of Iran or some scriptures that relate to that, I first want to talk about the true nature of Iran's and their proxies' war with Israel and their commitment to Israel's destruction. What is the central focus and motivation? And what I will say about that is simply this, and that is, it is spiritual. This is not essentially a political conflict, and people need to understand this. These radical Islamic groups that we've mentioned, they do not view Israel in terms of foreign policy, of the Palestinian right to autonomy, to peace processes, to ceasefires. The very existence of Israel, the Jewish state, which has been introduced into the heart of Islamic world, is seen as an affront to Islam itself, and the only solution being that Israel must cease to exist. So this is the motivation behind all of these groups and their desire to destroy Israel. Israel's death sentence on Israel's rooted actually in Shiite Islamic doctrine. In it, the United States is viewed as the great Satan, Israel as the little Satan, and both are to be destroyed by Muslims, after which Islamic rule can be imposed on the rest of the world. Now, original Shiite doctrine, of course, which is much older than the United States, only focuses on Israel's destruction. And it's believed that Israel must be destroyed by an international Islamic force that's commanded by the Mahdi. This is, again, end time Shiite doctrine that's going to be commanded by a Mahdi who is a Muslim leader who disappeared supposedly down a well. By the way, I don't know what he was doing in the well 1,150 years ago, but he's going to supposedly resurface in the end times. Okay. Anyway, this Shia death sentence on Israel is irrevocable. It was noted in a well-known statement. This statement has been quoted many times by Islam's founder, Muhammad. And this is a quote from Muhammad. "The time of judgment will not dawn," and this is meant to be end times, "until Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them, in consequence of which the Jew will hide behind rocks and trees. And every tree and rock will say, 'O Muslim, O slave of Allah, behind me is a Jew, come here and kill him.'" I'm sure you've heard that, Chris.
Yeah, totally. That's very, and that's in the Quran, right?
It must be. I'm not a student of the Quran, but it's a quote from Muhammad, so I assume that's where.
Right. That is the Quran. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's interesting in all this, as we mentioned, all the mentions of in the beginning, all the mentions of Persia, then called Persia, in the Bible, is that the Bible also describes an end time battle between Persia and its allies with Israel. But God appears to have a very different take, by the way, on the outcome of this battle. You can find this, those of you that read your Bibles, you can find this account in chapters 38 and 39 of the book of Ezekiel. In these chapters, there is an alliance of nations, and it's interesting that God actually inspires to attack Israel in order for God to severely judge them. Now, most of the names of these countries in this alliance are not recognizable today except by Bible scholars. They include Gog from the land of Magog, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah. These nations have been identified again by biblical scholars with current day Russia, Turkey, Sudan, Libya, and other nations that are located in Central Asia. The one nation included, whose name we're all familiar with, we should be at least by now if you've gotten through this podcast, is Persia, known today as Iran. So I'm going to read a few of these verses, and as we're concluding here, from these chapters, and allow them, I'm not going to do a commentary on it. We'll just allow them to speak for themselves. So this is Ezekiel 38, 1 through 8. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I'm against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. I will turn you around. This is what I'm talking about. God is leading these people groups to attack Israel because God intends to bring judgment upon them there. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with you, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you. Prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. After many days, you will be visited. And this is when we're talking about end times. In the latter years, you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel. So this is talking about a period of time after the Jews have been regathered from all the nations, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, this is the Jews, and now all of them dwell safely. And that's a whole other issue, by the way, Chris. And even some could say, looking what's happening now, and if we move into a time of peace around Israel, which is possible if this Iranian, influence is mitigated, and you see, the Abraham Accords coming to the fore, and peace being made, especially with the Sunni nations round about Israel, it is possible that Israel could live in this period of time of peace that's referred to in Ezekiel 38. Okay, this is Ezekiel 38:16. You will come up against my people, Israel, like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me. This is what's interesting, that God is doing something here that the nations are going to see. I mean, look at what's happening even now, Chris. Yeah. I mean, what's happened in Israel in this current war and what's taken place over the last year is a focus of the nations today, that the nations may know me when I'm hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. And it will come to pass at the same time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face. And then Ezekiel 38, 22, and 23, and I will bring him, this is this group of people, to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus, this is God speaking, I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of the nations. Again, nations in Hebrew, goim, the Gentiles. The nations are going to look at what's happening in Israel and how God has intervened. So they shall know, God says, that I am the Lord. And in Ezekiel 39, 7 and 8, so I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my name anymore. Then the nations, Gentiles, shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Surely it is coming, and it shall be done, says the Lord. This is the day of which I have spoken. Now, when God says it's coming, and surely it's going to be done, I got news for you. It's coming, and surely it's going to be done, because it's the word of the Lord. And I just want to conclude with this, Chris, because these are verses that I've shared before in a different context. But this is so to me, so heartwarming. It's something to look forward to. It's something to pray about. It's the reason I believe you and I are doing what we're doing today. The motivation is what God is doing in Israel and between Israel and, again, believers throughout the world. But okay, so this is a summary of Israel's history, of this story, the Israel story, our failure, and then God's restoration of us. And it's in Ezekiel 39, following, this account of the war that we're talking about that God intervenes in. It's Ezekiel 39, 21 through 24, our history of failure, really, as a people. I will set my glory among the nations. Again, all of this is a play that God is producing before the eyes of the nations. And all the nations shall see my judgment, which I've executed, and my hand, which I've laid on them. So the house of Israel shall know that I'm the Lord their God from that day forward. The Gentiles shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity, which means we lost our land for their iniquity, because they were unfaithful to me. Therefore I hid my face from them. I gave them into the hand of their enemies, and they all fell by the sword. It's really interesting, Chris, that because of our sins, and I'm speaking as a Jew, because of our sins, God gave us into the hands of our enemies. But in the end, he's going to deliver us from the hands of our enemies. According to their uncleanness and according to their transgressions, I've dealt with them, and I've hidden my face from them. But this is where God's heading. Ezekiel 39, 25 through 29. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, now I will bring back the captives of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel. And I will be jealous for my holy name after they've borne their shame and all their unfaithfulness in which they were unfaithful to me, when they dwelt safely in their own land and no one made them afraid. When I have brought them back from the peoples, gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and I'm hallowed in them in the sight of many nations. And one of the ways we've just read he's going to be hallowed is, again, his judgment on Israel's enemies. Then they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who sent them into captivity among the nations, but also brought them back to their land and left none of them captive any longer. And I will not hide my face from them anymore, for I shall have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, says the Lord God. This, Chris, is the reason that those who love the Lord, and hopefully, those that are listening to this podcast, and that those that love the Lord stand with what God's doing in Israel. As we've said time and time again, this is not an issue of what the Jewish people deserve. This is not an issue of, the Jews living in Israel always doing what's right. They don't, but neither do you. Whoever you are who are listening, none of us do what's right all the time. The reason we need to stand with Israel is what God is doing there. And the fact that God is using, the regathering of the Jewish people back to their land and their eventual salvation to glorify his holy name, so that all the nations are going to know that he's God. And with that, I rest my peace.
That's great, John. Well, thank you so much. This is awesome. Well, guys, I think we're only going to do maybe one more episode of The One New Man on more of kind of the modern day geopolitical stuff. And then we're going to get back into the theological and biblical teaching, which is really where John and I both share a passion for that. So, we're going to hopefully be having in the next week or two a surprise guest on the show we're going to be doing an interview with, and we're very excited about this. We will put that in the show notes when that does happen. But we're going to wrap up today then. So if you guys like this, please feel free to share it, send it to your friends, like it, give us a review on Spotify or YouTube or Rumble or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're checking this out. And we are also doing kind of our year-end fundraising. We have a spread that goes in the middle of the show. But if you've been blessed by this at all, or if you enjoy listening to this, at this point, it's totally, just kind of self-funded. And so it's a small thing, but if you feel led to in any ways, help contribute financially to that, we're just going to do an ask over the next 2 weeks at the year end here, just to give people an option who are checking this out and who are listening. Everything is a tax-free donation, obviously, so you can write that off. And you would just go to the israelstory.org/donate to give to the program. And so don't feel any pressure to do that, but if you feel led to do that, we would be very blessed for that. And so we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for checking it out, and have a Merry Christmas month. All right. Thank you, guys.